Happy holidays, everyone, and in the spirit of the holidays, I thought I would review something that's based on arguably the best Christmas movie ever made. This is Die Hard: Nakatomi Plaza for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Piranha Games and published by Sierra in 2002 exclusively for PC, and those of you who are fans of MechWarrior Online or MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries might be surprised to know that the developers of those actually got their start with this particular game. This was the debut title of Piranha Games, and it did get a pretty mixed reception when it came out, which was not exactly uncommon for movie licensed games of the era. And let's be honest here, movie licensed games are generally pretty vilified among the gaming community and, of course, critics as well. And for a lot of games, that is perfectly justified, because a lot of movie licensed games are low effort, low budget messes that just ended up not being enjoyable at all, really. But how does Die Hard: Nakatomi Plaza fit into this? Is it one of those unfortunate movie licensed games that ends up being crap? Or is it more middling fare, like many people thought at the time it was released? Or is it actually more of a hidden gem? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which in this particular case runs on LithTech 2.0. It's more or less the same engine that powered the operative No One Lives Forever, which is usually just referred to as No One Lives Forever. And at the time Nolf came out, it was a pretty advanced engine, although it had seen some additional development by the time Die Hard: Nakatomi Plaza would come out. In fact, by the time Die Hard: Nakatomi Plaza came out, Monolith was already working on a more advanced version of the engine that would see the light of day with No One Lives Forever 2, A Spy in Harm's Way, which came out later the same year, actually, and it was a much more advanced looking game than this is. That's not necessarily to say that Nakatomi Plaza is a terrible looking game or anything. For its era, it looks alright, but a lot of the environments are very bland. You're dealing with a lot of gray interiors, you're dealing with a lot of office spaces that just seem to repeat themselves, and while some of the areas are certainly faithful reproductions of what you see in the actual Die Hard film, unfortunately, those moments are surprisingly few and far between compared to the vast amount of filler areas that lead you to those moments. And with this being an early 2000s first-person shooter, the modeling is recognizable for what it's trying to depict, but certainly not especially detailed, and the texture quality is pretty rough by modern standards, although at the time it would have been pretty decent. And unfortunately, since the game is anchored in reality by being an adaptation and expansion of a film featuring live actors, the graphics have aged more poorly than they would had this been a stylized action game like, say, the No One Lives Forever titles, or of course fantasy or sci-fi games, all of which are going to age at least a bit better than something depicting something more realistic. And then of course, this being almost 20 years later, there are a lot of compatibility issues with modern systems and modern hardware. Obviously, that wasn't a problem if you were running this back in the day, and of course if you're running it on period hardware these days, it's not going to be a problem. But if you're running it on modern systems, you have to do things like limit the frame rate, and you have to do some tweaks to make sure the mouse is working correctly. Otherwise, the game is basically unplayable. Now, obviously, I'm not going to hold that against the developers because they had no way of knowing back in 2002 that this was going to be a problem almost 20 years later. It is something that you do need to be aware of if you're looking at giving this game a try, however. So the graphics were pretty decent for their time, but have aged particularly poorly, and the engine has obviously had some issues crop up over the years. But what about the sound design? Well, generally speaking, it is mediocre to outright crap. The only actor from the original film to reprise their role is Reginald VelJohnson, who played, of course, Sergeant Al Powell in the film, and as you might expect, he does a pretty good job, but all of the other characters are voiced by people who don't really sound at all like the people they're trying to emulate. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is certainly difficult to find people to replace the likes of Bruce Willis and Alan Rickman, but the characters they got to do the replacement voices were either mediocre in the case of characters like John McClane, or outright terrible like in the case of Hans Gruber.
Now, I have a machine gun. Ho, ho, ho.
Now, while obviously this is really disappointing if you're a fan of the film, the fact that they were even able to get Reginald VelJohnson in here is surprising, because most games of that era, if they were movie licensed, didn't actually have the actual actors from the film voicing their characters in the games. That said, the voice acting here is still pretty bad for the most part, so it's not exactly excusable. And things really don't improve much when you move to the other aspects of the sound design. Instead of using the film's soundtrack, it uses what sounds like a bunch of incredibly generic and weak tunes that you would hear from a royalty-free music site, and they just end up being incredibly weak, while the actual sound effects are an absolute mess. When you're going through things like reloads, it sounds like a bunch of assets pulled from a generic sound library, and when they're actually shooting at things, the M60 sounds like it was pulled from a generic sound library, and all the other guns just sound incredibly weak. I mean, sure, the sound effects themselves are fairly loud, but they don't really sound like guns, and it just ends up grating on your nerves after a while. And when you bring all of this together, you end up with a presentation that is something of a mixed bag, but for the most part, it's not very good. But of course, what really matter and what could ultimately redeem this game from its presentation issues are the story and the gameplay. Except that the story doesn't really matter all that much because it's just the story of Die Hard the film, translated into a video game and stretched out to include a whole lot of filler content. Now of course, chances are if you are watching this video and you're interested in this particular game, you have seen the film Die Hard, so I don't need to talk about the story for you. But if for whatever baffling reason you haven't seen the film Die Hard, I highly recommend you do so, because it is one of the best action movies ever made, and certainly one of the best action movies of the 80s. And of course, it being the holiday season, Die Hard is a perfect choice of something to watch, because it is in fact a Christmas movie. Anyway, to give you a brief summary of the plot of Die Hard, and thus the plot of Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza, John McClane is visiting his estranged wife at a Christmas party at the Nakatomi Plaza building where she works, when a group of bad guys under the leadership of Hans Gruber violently seize control of the building. McClane ends up being caught in the middle of all of this and has to fight his way through Gruber's goons in order to rescue his wife. On the surface, it's a pretty straightforward and simple story, which is pretty par for the course with most action movies, but there are some nuances to it that make it one of the more lasting action movies of the era, all of which are unfortunately lost when you go to this particular game, because even though it does cover the same story, it doesn't do it anywhere near the level of quality that the actual movie shows. So if you're looking for the story here, just go watch the movie Die Hard, because the game itself only adds a ton of filler content that does get you between major moments from the movie, but really doesn't add anything worthwhile to it. So really everything ultimately falls to the gameplay to bring things up here. So what exactly does the gameplay of Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza entail? Well, you're going to be playing as John McClane and going from level to level, mowing down any of Gruber's goons that get in your way, using a small arsenal of weapons. Specifically, your pistol is a Beretta 92, you have a submachine gun in the form of the MP5, you have 2 assault rifles in the form of an M16 and a Steyr AUG, and then you have a machine gun in the form of the M60. And there are 3 ammunition types: 9mm ammunition, which is used in the Beretta 92 and the MP5, 5.56mm, which is used in the M16 and the AUG, and then 7.62mm ammunition, which is used exclusively in the M60. Of these, the 9mm ammunition is absolutely plentiful, whereas the other 2 types of ammunition are a lot harder to come by, meaning that for the vast majority of the game, you're going to be using almost exclusively the MP5 submachine gun. Because once you get access to the MP5, the Beretta 92 becomes an afterthought. You're not going to bother with it anymore. And since ammunition is not exactly commonplace for the 5.56 or 7.62 weapons, you're not going to be using them as much. You're going to probably reserve them more for the occasional boss fight that the game has. Aside from the various guns that you have access to, you also have access to flashbang grenades that you can throw at enemies to temporarily blind them, but it's not as useful as you might hope. The effect doesn't last very long, and it doesn't really seem to do a whole lot except in very short radius around the grenade. In addition to the various weapons that you have access to, you also have some items that you can use to progress further in the game, whether that be the axe that you can pick up to smash through boards, or the wire cutter that you can use to cut wires in order to progress, or a fire extinguisher that you can put out fires with. In addition to these, there's also the Zippo lighter that you can whip out if you're in a dark area and need some light, but if you have it out, the only weapon you can use along with it is the pistol. And sometimes you'll need to prove that you're not one of Hans Gruber's goons, so you'll need to whip out your badge and show it to people. This was also well before regenerating health became the norm for first-person shooters, so you need to find items to replenish your health scattered around the levels. These come in the form of medkits that are mounted on the walls, and you open them up and can use the health items in there to restore a bit of health each. Now, of course, if you take a quick glance down at the bottom left, where all of the meters are, you might think that you have 3 separate ratings for health, but you actually don't. The one that's next to the heart icon is your health meter. The meter directly below that, next to the lungs icon, is your stamina meter, and then the meter below that, which is next to the brain icon, is your morale meter. The health meter is obviously pretty self-explanatory. Once it bottoms out, you die, and you can replenish it by going to the medkits scattered around and using the health replenishing items. The stamina meter goes down as you run around and jump, and it also affects your ability to run around and jump. The lower the stamina meter, the slower you'll run, and the weaker your jump will be. So you'll want to make sure that you take a few moments to rest up every so often. And then there's the morale meter, which does have a correlation with the health meter, because as you continue to take damage, your morale will go down, and as you continue to replenish your health, your morale will go up. But I have no idea what it actually does in the game, because it seems like whatever it was intended to do doesn't work. From what I understand, it's supposed to have an effect on the enemy AI, but like I said, it seems to be broken and not actually do anything. So you can pretty safely ignore the morale meter and just focus on the health especially, but also the stamina meter, because the stamina does take a while to drain, but it takes even longer for it to replenish. As you wander around the various levels, you're going to find that a lot of the environments are pretty cramped, and you're going to be having to lean around corners an awful lot to shoot at enemies, because you really can't take all that much damage before you go down. So while you might have been expecting this to be more of a run-and-gun shooter, being based on an 80s action movie, it actually forces you to play it more slowly and methodically than you would really expect, and it ends up playing somewhere between a more regular first-person shooter, for lack of a better term, and a tactical shooter. And while you can certainly get used to that pacing, the pacing itself is actually not so much the problem. It's not even so much of a problem that you're squishy. The problem is that the game is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes enemies will go down in maybe 1 or 2 shots. Other times, they'll take an entire magazine before going down, and it doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason why. You would expect, if they're going for more of a tactical approach, that pretty much everything would go down in a small number of hits, yourself included, but since there's so much inconsistency, you're not really sure what vibe they were actually going for. And it certainly doesn't help that the gunplay in general is a mess. I mean, enemies can take a wildly inconsistent amount of shots to go down, but on top of that, the weapons themselves really aren't very accurate. They seem to just spray bullets all over the place, so you can never really get much precision out of any of your weapons, except for, of course, the AUG, because it has a scope. But even when you're at close range and just spraying an enemy down, sometimes they'll only take a few bullets, other times they'll take an entire magazine and still be standing, and it's just so inconsistent it leaves you incredibly frustrated. It also really doesn't help that enemies don't react much at all to being shot and can just take numerous hits while still being able to shoot you at the same time, and sometimes it doesn't even seem like the bullets are doing anything at all, like the hits just aren't registering. Now apparently there is a mod that is called the Improved Edition that sets out to fix some of these issues by lowering the recoil animation and improving the hit registration as well as enemies reacting to taking damage, but something so fundamental to a first-person shooter shouldn't be the thing that modders need to fix. I mean, it's one thing when modders are setting about fixing compatibility issues with modern systems, or putting in additional bug fixes that were just missed in patches, or which have cropped up later on, or things like that. But it's another thing entirely for modders to have to basically rewrite fundamental game code for it to even be tolerable. Because that's ultimately the thing with Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza. It's not even that it's a mediocre to somewhat subpar first-person shooter like a lot of people of the time were saying. Gunplay in most first-person shooters of the era wasn't this bad. Now sure, it's not the worst movie licensed game I've ever played or anything, and in the grand scheme of those, it's just on the bad side. But in general, as a first-person shooter, Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza is an outright bad game, and that puts it at a 1.5 out of 5 on my scale. And while that Improved Edition mod does help to some degree, it's not able to fully mitigate the problems that the game has, and it's certainly not worth going through the hassle of setting this game up and getting it working properly on a modern system, considering the compatibility workarounds you have to do, which may or may not even work. For a while, they were actually working just fine, and I was able to play through the game, but when I went back and tried to get additional gameplay footage for this video, for some utterly baffling reason, my frame rate limiter just wouldn't work anymore, and I tried messing around with the settings and even trying additional methods for limiting the frame rate, and it just wouldn't work, so I was stuck with the game running way too fast, and of course the game not having proper mouse input, because the game running too fast also causes the mouse input to become extremely jittery and not work properly, so you basically can't aim at anything. In other words, if the game's not running at exactly 60 frames per second on modern systems, it's outright unplayable. Obviously, if your frame rate limiter works, then you can get around that, but mine just stopped working all of a sudden, and I have absolutely no idea why. And to be perfectly honest with you, a game this bad is just not worth going through the effort of getting it back up and running on a modern system, just so you can experience an outright crap first-person shooter. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope you are having a good holiday season right now. I know it's been a very rough year, and hopefully 2021 will be better, but suffice to say, this is going to be the last review of 2020 before the New Year's Day review of 2021. I'm not sure yet whether or not I'm going to be able to get a My Thoughts On video up in the meantime, but the definite next review is going to be next Friday for the new year, so stay tuned for that. And if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All of the money from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case is. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and unless I get an MTO up in the meantime, I will see you all with the next review in 2021.